Hello and welcome to episode 233 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast and the sixth in our series Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. Today's episode looks at what we can do as individuals to maintain a sense of connection with our team members or work colleagues and or to avoid that feeling of loneliness creeping in. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, which is a show about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and how distributed organizations are evolving. The company behind this podcast is Virtual Not Distant, and I'm its director, Pilar Orti. If we haven't met before, welcome. Nice to meet you. And we exist to help managers and their teams transition to an office-optional approach. You can find everything about us over at virtualnotdistant.com, and you can also send us your feedback through there. Now, the episode you're listening to now is part of a 7-episode series, so we're almost at the end of it, and we have been creating this in collaboration with ShieldGEO, which is a distributed company, and they help organizations employ people all over the world, internationally, by looking after their tax, payroll, essentially. What they do is they simplify the process of having an employee in a different country, which is complicated. And indeed, Bree Cagiatti is driving this series. And what I particularly liked about today's episode, which I've already listened to, obviously, is that we also hear from her, from our host, Bree. We hear what works for her, what she's tried out, and she really pulls together the guest reflections and thoughts into one very clear message. And I have to say also that today's episode has a lot in it that I'd never thought of before. So, and I've been thinking about this stuff for a while. So listeners, I hope that you will find it interesting too. So I'm going to leave you now with Bree and guests, and I'll pop in at the end of the episode to remind you how you can get in touch.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Connection and Disconnection in Remote Teams. As always, I'm your host, Bree Cagiatti, and I'm taking us through this short series on behalf of ShieldGEO and in collaboration with Virtual Not Distant. On today's episode, we're looking at what we can do as individuals to help prevent isolation occurring as remote workers. We'll cover what self-reflection can look like and talk through some of the resources we can use when we need a little extra help. Now, this is our 6th episode in this series, and it'll be our final one of this journalistic format. So if you haven't listened back to our previous episodes yet, I encourage you to do that. Otherwise, let's get stuck in. Self-reflection is something that we've covered a fair bit throughout this series already, because it seems to be a necessary component to addressing disconnection. Unlike a physical ailment, these feelings are not always outwardly visible to others or even to ourselves. We already know that remote workers commonly experience feelings of isolation, but we've also found that going back to the office isn't exactly a cure either. When we reflect on our own experiences, it can help us to develop effective strategies that are tailored to our own needs. It helps us to be active and creative in the structure of our work and life rather than just letting it all happen to us. Laurel Farah, founder of Distribute Consulting, argues that remote work may not even be the issue for you. It could just be revealing an underlying problem that you weren't able to see before.
Yeah, it's an important conversation to be having. I think that, like you said before, remote work is not necessarily the problem, but it is allowing us to see the problems more easily, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. You know, we're so quick to react like, oh, I started working remotely, I started feeling isolated and unhappy, and so therefore I'm going to go straight back to the office. Like, well, no, be willing to sit in that uncomfortable zone long enough to self-reflect and say, well, why am I unhappy? And, maybe just your long commute or being in a busy and hectic environment was just distracting you and covering up some larger problems that now you're left alone with. And so be willing to solve those problems in your life, and it can really lead to an even greater success in the long run.
Now, I think we all know that we as humans are programmed to avoid pain and discomfort, which is really helpful in stopping us from burning our hands on stovetops. But It's not always as helpful in discovering the root issue to some of our painful feelings or destructive behaviours. It's incredibly common for us to develop coping mechanisms that momentarily soothe the pain of isolation or loneliness, rather than asking ourselves why we feel this way or actively seeking out longer-term solutions. But like many things in life, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worthwhile.
Yeah, I just think it's important for anybody that is feeling isolated to conduct some self-evaluation and really reflect on why they are feeling isolated and to proactively think of solutions. Like you said, sometimes our days and our lives blur together in remote work and our environments aren't changing as much, and so therefore it's hard to identify, well, I feel bad. Well, why do I feel bad? Why is my relationship with my family suffering? Why am I gaining weight? Like what are these things? What are these a symptom of?
But it's not actually all that easy to think critically about ourselves because we're fundamentally biased. It can take a lot of practice and, in some cases, external help to develop good reflection skills. Marcus Vermuth, manager of engineering team at Buffer, thinks that having an engineering background where he was constantly problem solving and asking questions helped him to develop these reflection skills in his personal life too.
I learned, especially in my shift, like my career shift and my focus on leadership and management, that self-reflection, self-awareness is a huge thing. And it's something that brings you forward a ton. And I've been looking at most of the things from that perspective when it comes to the loneliness problem or other problems with myself. I ask myself a ton of questions. Sometimes I relate it back to having an engineering background. Although I'm a full manager now, I don't code anymore, not even on the side. I tend to ask a lot of questions. Why is that? Why is it working like that? Even my wife sometimes asks, why are you doing this or not that? I tend to ask a lot of questions. So I think that helps me with the self-reflection part.
For others, this may all be completely new territory. Workplace psychologist and founder of Work Life Psych, Richard McKinnon, says that that's okay, and that we can all learn these skills regardless of our backgrounds.
So I would say we can learn to be more self-aware. If we couldn't, I wouldn't have a job. Fundamentally, a lot of the development work I do with people is helping them to notice more about themselves so that they can notice more about others. So maybe if you use the word notice, because that's noticing what am I saying to myself? Am I being overly harsh or critical? Or when do I get tired? Or what tasks do I love doing? And what am I more likely to procrastinate about or to try and avoid completely? And who are the kinds of people that I just can't wait to work with, that, they really excite me or they make me laugh? This is self-awareness, learning more about your preferences. That it is as simple as that.
In his practice with clients, Richard often takes the role of the person asking the questions, which helps to facilitate this kind of reflective thinking for those who may find it difficult. It's not necessarily his role to provide answers, but instead to guide his clients to find solutions for themselves.
I'd start by asking them, because to me, coaching is all about questions. Does that work for you? Or are you missing something here? And if you are missing something, what could you do about it? And hopefully they will come up with the idea, well, there's a park down the street. I could get a walk in before I start work in the morning. So that will be one of the things that we discuss. How can you make your routine work for you to allow you to experience what it is you want to experience and not assume you must be here in front of a computer screen, every hour of the day?
By asking ourselves these sorts of questions, or in this case, seeing someone who will ask those questions of us, the solutions tend to be more personal and unique to our actual situation. It won't be these pat answers like, well, just call a friend when you feel lonely, or you mustn't be suited to working from home, better go back to the office. Instead, it'll be answers to questions like, what makes me feel connected? What helps me to feel productive? When do I feel low? And what am I doing when I feel good?
And so we need to remember there's no one size fits all with this. I would start with the individual and say, what is it that you want? And how much social contact do you need? Because for many people, there's a reason they're working in the way that they are, because it suits their personality and they feel they don't need all of that contact. And so, I don't go with a checklist, but explore, given your circumstances, given your context, what's possible. And maybe now we can push the envelope a little bit and get you out of your comfort zone so that you can experience other things to see if they work for you or not.
Richard also notes that it's not just asking the questions, it's capturing the answers so you can reflect on progress and change over time. What we can handle in the first few months of working from home might be different 6 months to a year later, which might be different again a few years after that. This means it can be difficult to stay on top of these feelings, as they may change gradually. Unless you're somehow tracking how you feel and what is and isn't working, you might not realize what's actually happening for you.
Now, the way to capture that, that I recommend with the people I work, my coachees, is, get a notebook and start writing this stuff down, because you won't remember it in a way that's going to be useful for you. And if you want to make changes to how you do things, it's good to have some data that you can look back on and say, that was an activity I was scared of doing 6 months ago, and now I like it. Or now it's bearable. I'm not that scared of it anymore. Or, hey, these were the thoughts I had about my manager when I started working here. But you know what? Now we have a relationship and I see where she was coming from, and wow, it's completely different. But without that sort of data trail, you're kind of living in the present constantly. So journaling is a cheap, effective, and not very time-consuming exercise. Jot down a few thoughts, a few big topics or issues from the day. Do that each evening, and that will give you some great information on you and the context you work in and your thoughts about the world. It's about connecting with life with intention rather than going through the motions or being on automatic pilot. And so that requires us to take a little bit of time, not a huge amount of time, but to take a step back and say, okay, what's meaningful to me right now in my life? Where do I want to get to? But also on a daily basis, okay, what's important today? If I finished the day happy, what would that look like? What would I get done? Who would I have spoken to? What do I need for this day to be a good day for me? More reflection like that rather than, I just need to survive. I need to get to 5 o'clock.
Now, there's plenty of ways to record reflections that can be integrated into your daily routines. It could be making notes in a journal, as Richard suggested, but there's also apps and programs and little exercise handbooks that can all help facilitate this kind of ongoing practice. In a sense, posing questions and encouraging self-reflection should already be part of your manager's toolkit, but it's up to you to do the actual work of reflecting. So, even though you may already have a scheduled weekly or monthly meeting with your manager, this could be an opportunity for you to share some of your observations. For Asia Hundley, one of ShieldGEO's customer success managers, it took a few months before she realized she needed to change some habits.
After maybe the first probably 2 or 3 months, I felt it affecting me in terms of I need to, speak to people and do things. So I definitely took an approach, and I was like, I'm going to sign up for exercise classes in the evenings. So I have something to do in the evenings, and I get out and I, speak to people and get the social interaction that I don't get during the day. So that was my first kind of strategy. And then I've just definitely stuck with that. And that's been something that I need to do a few times a week in the evenings to get out. And then obviously once I started coming to the co-working space, that was another thing that I didn't realize I needed it until I got here.
She now works in a co-working space most days, which he says has helped her stay focused and feel a part of a wider community.
When I first joined Shield, there wasn't anyone else on my team who worked from a co-working space, besides the ladies who used to go into the office sometimes in London, but that's because, we have an office there. So I guess it never really occurred to me because I wasn't hearing about anyone on my team, going on their own to get out and work from a co-working space. But my original thought was when I started was that in the summer, I wasn't going to be able to work in my apartment because the temperatures in Madrid in the summer are almost at, 40 degrees Celsius. And and we live in an attic, and my office is upstairs. So it just was going to be physically impossible for me to be there working in July and August. So that was the plan. And when I talked about it when we were in Thailand for our retreat with Tim and Duncan, and Tim said, oh, well, you don't have to wait until the summer. If you want to go and check it out now, why don't you just go and check it out? And if you like it, we can get you set up now to go. And so that's what I did. I researched a few co-working spaces, and then I came here to this WeWork. And I was like, this is what I need to be here a few days a week. And then once I started coming, I realized, how was I surviving, 40 hours a week in my apartment by myself?
Through trialing different solutions, Asia found what worked for her, something that gave her structure and that incidental interaction she was searching for.
Yeah, it's just, I think, like getting out, not being physically isolated, and then also getting into, a routine of waking up in the morning and, getting dressed and going to the office, so to speak. And I speak sometimes to people in reception, and it's like all a community. It still feels like a community. And at the WeWork too, they have like networking events. They have happy hours on Thursdays. They have yoga, they have manicures, they have all these different things that you can sign up for if you want to like learn about what everyone else in the community is working on. So it definitely does give you, if you're interested in that, it gives you a chance to like engage.
But again, while exercise classes and co-working spaces worked for Asia, doesn't mean that has to be your solution too. For Richard, it looked like finding someone he could regularly have video calls with.
I know as someone who started a business that I was working alone a lot more than I did when I worked for someone. And I realized that just opening Skype and having a quick chat with someone in a similar circumstance, that went a long way in the working day for me. And it didn't have to be anything deep or long. It was just, hey, you're in the same position. Here's what I'm working on. How are you? Maybe have a coffee at the same time. But it didn't require me to derail my day for that kind of social contact.
For you, it might be more around how you structure your day that makes a difference, or a certain hobby that recharges you so you actually have the energy to interact with those around you. Laurel reiterates that it's not about the specifics. Rather, it's about going through the process of finding out what you need to thrive and implementing it into your routine.
And so to reflect and to be willing to experiment and say, okay, this week I'm going to try going to a gym, or this week I'm going to try working from a co-working space, or this week I'm going to try taking more breaks, or I'm going to eat different food, or I'm going to I'm going to have a meeting with my manager. I'm going to start a new Slack channel, whatever. I'm going to start a, belly dancing class, like whatever it is, like be willing to experiment and to try and to proactively find a solution for yourself. And so sometimes that's going to be work related, sometimes it's going to be in your personal life, but be willing to identify the root of the problem and make a change. And sometimes that takes a long time, and sometimes it changes too. I mean, I've been a remote worker for, like I said, 13 years now. And what worked for me in the beginning is very different than what worked for me 5 years ago, which is very different than what works for me now. So always be evaluating yourself, just like a manager evaluates you professionally. Evaluate yourself as a worker and as just a human being, and say, what do I need, and what do I need to thrive, and how can I fill that gap?
I know for me, when I'm not functioning at my best, I'm prone to procrastinate, and I can sometimes end up working on something late in the night or let it spill over to the weekend. Admittedly, at first, this doesn't seem to be that problematic to me. I come from a freelance background and I really enjoy my work, so doing a little late at night or on a Saturday morning doesn't seem so bad. But it's over time, if this cycle continues, that I start to run into issues. It might mean I'm perhaps no longer exercising in the evening or cooking a nourishing meal because I don't feel like I have the time. It can stop me from spending time with my partner and my friends, which contributes to me feeling disconnected and less like myself. It might mean that I'm not spending enough time decompressing before the next day, or participating in hobbies and activities that actually contribute to my creativity and build up my resilience towards stress and conflict. So you can see how it feeds in on itself and sort of becomes a compounding cycle that can be really difficult to get out of. I found that I need to set fairly strict finish times for myself and either go for a walk or exercise to signify the end of the day. Something about changing clothes and doing something physical that's really helpful for my brain to understand that the work day's over. I know of people who do something similar in the morning to start work. They'll leave their house to get a coffee or walk the dog to simulate a sort of commute and get them into the headspace to work. This kind of ritual can encourage positive social interactions too, which is something that Richard really recommends.
I do a lot of work in the area of resilience and helping people be more resilient in the face of challenges. And actually, there's some simple things that we can do to contribute to our own kind of toolkit that we can use before we face difficulties. And one of those is to seek out positive interpersonal interactions. And that doesn't need to be anything deep and meaningful, but making human connection that is positive and not threat-centered is good for us. It helps us feel good about ourselves, and it helps us feel positive about the day ahead.
These small interactions boost our self-esteem and sense of place within the community. If you're on a walk, try saying hello to your neighbours as you pass them, or have a small chat with someone at the dog park. Maybe you could ask your barista how their day's going, or talk about the weather while you're in line. It all adds up. We can replicate these little interactions virtually too. Shield's client services manager, Brenda, starts every single day off with a good morning message, replete with funny gifs or a collection of emojis to our Skype group, which includes everyone in the Americas time zone. These messages not only make me smile, but they also provide opportunity for further interaction and connection. I've seen firsthand how a happy Taco Tuesday text leads to sharing recipes and photos from someone making Mexican food later in the day. Psychologist and researcher Julian Holt shares that reaching out and supporting others can actually have stronger benefits to us than if we receive that support ourselves. Helping people makes us feel like a necessary player, gives us a sense of purpose and a common goal that we can all work towards.
Research has shown that providing support to others can have stronger benefits than actually receiving support. And so one of the things that we can think about is that by helping others, that's also one of the best ways to help ourselves. And so for those who might be perhaps feeling like they might be a bit isolated or feeling awkward in a social situation, if they can look around the room and see, okay, who in the room might need someone to talk to, and think of it as a way to help someone else, it's a way to feel less vulnerable and a way to help potentially get ourselves out of that situation and help others in the process.
But reaching out to others doesn't always come naturally to people, particularly in remote settings. But Theresa Douglas, author of Working Remotely, encourages us that it's simply another skill to practice.
It's really important to get used to putting yourself out there. And it comes back to giving first. So you're going to toss little things out into the ether, and sometimes someone's going to catch it and toss something back at you, and sometimes that you're just never going to see that little thing again. But I've found generally people are grateful when you try to be friendly, because they would like to be friendly too, but maybe they're a little shyer, or they're overwhelmed, or they think, I don't know that person, why would they want to talk to me? And so I'm shameless on Slack and an email. If I've been at a meeting with somebody and I thought they said something good, or if there's something I didn't quite understand or I wanted clarity, it's an excuse to reach out and say, hey, do you mind if I have 10 minutes of your time just to get a little more on that thing you said in the meeting, because that was interesting? People usually give you 10 minutes.
For some people, this may mean making a plan. Richard suggests mapping out potential questions you could ask ahead of time in order to build up some conversation skills. But he often finds that it's not the practical skills that are holding people back. Instead, it's more likely fears or lack of confidence.
So at a fundamental level, I think you could call the skill relationship management. In the workplace, I talk about relationships being like houseplants. You can't assume they're going to survive. You have to tend to them and look after them and invest in them. And then you get the benefits of them. You get to enjoy them. They're in your environment. It's win-win. And so it can be really like baby steps for some people, thinking about ways that they can speak to the people around them, thinking about how they can share information that others might find useful, or do a simple exercise whereby they kind of map out their network in their team and map out what it is they don't know about people. So things that they would expect to know about others, do they know them? about other people. You know, are they married? How long have they worked here? And so they can build up almost, you know, a conversational toolkit. But that's a list of things to ask people. What I often have to work with is the confidence and fear associated with this, because for a lot of people, it will go back to school and maybe their experience of being not part of a group in education. And so they've built up coping mechanisms that in the short term help them, but in the long term, they don't, because they lead to isolation. And they might assume others' motivations rather than finding out others' motivations. So it comes back to that question a lot. What's the worst that could happen if you made that phone call? Or what's the worst that could happen if you said to that person, do you want to grab a coffee? Or if you just instigated a conversation with the person next to you. And sometimes it's about looking for evidence. You know, is it the case? Or have you arrived at a big assumption that you know, I'm not a good fit here? Or even when you say I'm not a good fit for this team, how is that helping you? And what could help you deal with this context? So there's a few different ways that you can come at this, but what I try and do at the very base of it all is to frame it in terms of skills and action. Because what we often do as humans is get caught up in our own heads with the thoughts and think about the thoughts, and they're just going round and around like a tumble dryer. Taking action that's in alignment with the kind of person we want to be, that's where you break that thinking cycle and experience the real world rather than the one you've constructed in your mind.
It's here that I think it's important to acknowledge that if you are really struggling, you might find it helpful to speak to either a therapist or psychologist or even your doctor about these kinds of feelings. I think sometimes we can get bombarded by all kinds of solutions that work for others and think that there's some kind of quick fix out there for us if we just keep looking, when actually there might be some serious underlying issues. This is where these well-intentioned suggestions to call a friend or start a hobby can really fall short, when what we really need is someone to listen. Marcus regularly writes on his blog about his ongoing use of therapy as a resource to understand and better himself. He's passionate about destigmatizing the process and often will talk about his experiences within his team in hopes that this sort of leading by example might encourage others to get help if they need it.
We all go to see a doctor if our knee hurts or if our finger hurts or if, you know, our insides kind of hurt, but it may mean organs. But going to like a therapist always seems like, oh my God, what is going on? It's, you know, it's just a different type of doctor to fix a problem. That's how I see it. That also leads into the answer of your question, whereas I wouldn't say that me going to therapy is related to work. I would rather see it the way that, I don't know where I read this. I read it somewhere in a book or somewhere, I can't remember, but work is part of my life. I know there's things like work-life balance, but work is just part of our lives. And we have to have boundaries of when we don't work and when we have the rest of our life, but it's just part of our life. So I wouldn't say that I can separate those things, because I go to therapy to work on myself. And then, of course, sometimes work topics come up. Our brains are so complicated. We can't just say, oh, this little thing there, there's a work issue. This little thing, that's another life issue. They all kind of fall into each other. You know, the isolation problem might relate in me not feeling productive. And in the evening, I feel stressed and frustrated with myself. And then it comes back to my relationship. And suddenly the work part mingled with my life, you know? So that's where I would say that it's not related to me with being a remote worker. I would say therapy is therapy. I go there to, you know, help do my life in a better way. You know, it's not that I'm sick or that I have an illness. It's just that I want to solve problems. I want to get better and I want to learn more about myself. And sometimes I say like therapy is just talking to a mirror, you know, that's ultimately what it is. And yeah, the work part is just part of that. It's just in there whenever something happens or whenever I feel bothered by it or I want to share something or want to talk about the topic. But it's not that I go to therapy because of work.
And if even that is too hard right now, know that that's okay too. Teresa recently went through a time where all she could manage was sitting in silence on her couch.
It takes energy to maintain friendships. And sometimes when you're in that cycle, it's extra energy to get out. and it's overwhelming. And I have definitely been in that place before. And some of these pat answers just don't work at first, really, because, okay, you've canceled plans. Who says you're not going to do it again? And that's when some kindness to yourself has to come into play. Sometimes the best thing to do is to say, okay, that's it. I've done this thing. I am out of control, and own the fact that you are. I know a few weeks ago, when I was coming off of being rather overwhelmed with things that I was doing, I sat on my couch and I just sort of stared into space for a while. That was not as productive as I've ever been, but it's what I needed to do. And having that downtime where it was really downtime, I mean, staring at a wall is not doing anything at all. But understanding that that's what you're going to need in that moment. And if your friend came to you and said, I am so overwhelmed right now, I just need to sit here and stare at a wall, you wouldn't tell them they were a bad person.
Within all these mentions of everyone's different and we need to find a path that works for us, I think it's also worth mentioning that we aren't always the best versions of ourselves either. Sometimes we can't manage an afternoon walk even though we know it's a healthy habit. Sometimes we can't even manage to ask for help. In those circumstances, we need to be really kind to ourselves and give ourselves the space to recover and try again.
Try and avoid this situation getting to such a stage where you feel you've no options, because that can feel very difficult. And then it's kind of binary. I stay here and I'm miserable, or I leave and I take all the risks.
These episodes aren't here to show you all the things that you should and shouldn't be doing, and I really hope that that's not the message that you receive. Instead, I'd love for them to encourage us all as a community to be a bit more thoughtful in how we structure our work and how it integrates into the rest of our lives. The specifics of your solution might look different to your coworker or manager or friend. So in that regard, I'm not advocating for walks or co-working spaces or sending emoji-filled messages to your workmates. What I am advocating for is prioritizing listening, reflecting, and questioning. I'm advocating for trying something new and noticing whether it was enriching or exhausting, committing to practices you know you love and are helpful to you, and treating yourself with kindness on the days you really just can't manage it. While you're at it, reach out to people you work with in whatever ways you can, and when it all gets too much, know that it's more than okay to ask for help. This marks the end of today's episode, and I really hope that you found it helpful and encouraging. And if you have anything to add to this conversation, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. As always, I'd love to extend a huge thank you to all of our guests that have spoken to me for this series. I think you'll all agree that they brought such rich perspectives to this conversation, and I really couldn't have put this together without them. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope you'll join us for our final episode where we reflect on this series together. It's been so great to have you, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. Talk soon.
Thank you, Bree, for the episode. It certainly has given me much to think about. Listeners, I really am extremely grateful to ShieldGEO for taking on this mammoth project, and I hope you've been enjoying it too. We do have one more episode to go, so do get in touch to share your own reflections and examples through virtualnotdistant.com, or you can email me, Pilar, Pilar, at virtualnotdistant.com, and let us know your thoughts on this huge topic of connection and disconnection in remote teams.